Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, we're beginning a new series of episodes about the history of bad ideas. We haven't done bad ideas for a while, but we have got plenty of new ones coming up. And we're starting with austerity, and with the economist Mark Blyth, who's written widely about why austerity is a bad idea. It's a word that you hear a lot in contemporary politics. We're going to be talking about why it is that politicians so often think when the going gets tough, their job is to make it tougher. This is a conversation mainly about politics, but also about economics. So there is going to be some talk in what follows about bond markets and capital flows. If that's not your thing, do stick with us because, as you will hear, we get to the heart of contemporary political arguments. We will be talking about DOGE and what's going on in the United States. We're going to be talking about what's happening in Argentina with Milei. We're going to be talking about what's happening in Britain. As you'll hear, we recorded this episode on Wednesday of this week, the day that Rachel Reeves announced her new spending review. And austerity is at the heart of those arguments as well. Even if some of the ideas here are a little complicated, the core idea, I think, is one we all understand. Austerity means cuts. It means cuts to public spending. It means trying to cut public debt. It means reining in the state, trying to balance the books, tightening the belt of government. All of that comes under the heading of austerity. The argument is not that austerity is always a bad idea. Sometimes some of that makes a lot of sense. The argument is about why, so often, it really doesn't work. Mark, we're going to talk about some contemporary examples of austerity. There always are some, right up to the present day. We're speaking on the day that Rachel Reeves has announced her new spending review for the UK. We're also going to be talking about some 20th century examples, but let's begin with the idea itself and its origins, its roots, because it's got its roots not just in politics, but almost in human psychology, I think. It tells us something about ourselves that this idea never goes away. So let me just give you a potted version and then you can flesh it out or tell me how this is wrong. My understanding is part of what we're talking about here is to do with the idea of the state. So when states were created, it was partly to protect people and their property. You might even say mainly. And the way that that worked was to get rich people to buy into this idea by telling them they would be protected too. But any state that's powerful enough to protect the property of rich people is powerful enough to take the property of rich people. And so there's an almost permanent state of anxiety that states will get greedy. And it's sort of hardwired into them. And therefore, they need to be constantly disciplined. And austerity is part of the expression of that belief that if you don't discipline states, they will always inherently gobble stuff up. Is that where this comes from?
I do indeed think it is. And we can go in different directions on this, but I mean, that's essentially it. So let's go for the backstory on what you just said. How did we get states? Because we have this idea, you can pick up the King James Bible and read about the state of Samaria or whatever, but these are not the things that we would identify as modern states. Modern states come around because in order to make a state, you need to, as Karl Polanyi put it, commodify things that are usually held in common, land, labor, capital, etc. And that's usually a violent process, hence the enclosures and so on and so forth. The English Civil War in many ways is tied up in the creation of those property rights and the sort of the settlement of that area with Parliament. So you create this state, and as you say, you then end up with this kind of liberal dilemma, which is I need the state to guard the property I've accumulated because it generates inequalities and people will come with pitchforks and try and get me. So I need protection for that to not happen. So I need to pay for the state. But if I pay enough, then ultimately these guys are the ones with all the guns and they could turn them on me. So I've got a bit of a problem. So how do I then do this? Well, one way you could do this is by making sure that you're in control of the funding. And the funding for the state and the emergence of capital markets, the emergence of government bond markets, etc., is an expression of precisely that attempt to maintain an arm's length, but nonetheless in control version of how states are funded and therefore what they can and cannot do. Reeves is struggling with the same thing today. It's essentially sort of the compounded legacies of centuries of this problem that has led her to run the biscuit tin as she does today.
And do you think at the heart of it is the idea, there are two versions of this, one of which is that once you've built these states, the state itself is inherently greedy. It will try and raise more money, it will borrow more money, and the people who work for it, even low-level bureaucrats, they won't be able to help themselves. There's a lot of 20th century economics that sort of believes that somehow you give human beings access to this kind of power, even low-level bureaucratic power, and they will abuse it. The other version is that states are inherently pandering institutions. They sort of can't help, because states themselves are anxious about losing legitimacy. They can't help but appeal to the lowest common denominator, and that the people out there are going to want cheap money, or they're going to want more welfare, whatever it is. But these are two different arguments. One is that the state is powerful and greedy. The other is that it's kind of weak almost. It's sort of a weak and pandering. They're both there in the austerity argument. But which one do you think tends to be the driver?
I think that the proponents of such arguments switch from one to the other without ever acknowledging the fact that they're different. They're both essentially bound up in Virginia school public choice theory. So to take the first one, right, the low-level bureaucrats, essentially bureaucrats are budget maximizers. If you give them an inch, they'll double their budget, they'll double the personnel. It's a tax drain. That's why they were drowning, right? And then you can flip it to the other one, which is essentially, well, the median voter. You have to capture the median voter. So you have to then, it's in the same framework, right? Political business cycles. When there's an election, they'll spend money and it'll make people feel rich, but it'll just cause inflation and so on and so forth. Hugely, profoundly important in the 1970s in shaping the institutions we developed in the 80s and the 90s. But they're two sides of the same coin. There's one you haven't mentioned, which I think is even more interesting. It goes all the way back to David Hume. And this is the one that really animates, if you will, the Austrian economists. And it goes something like this. In order for a government bond market to function, you have to a minimum, trust the state. And if you trust the state to basically take a lot of money from you on 10 or 15 years and then promise to pay it back, then the chances are, you're going to take that because it's a pretty good deal. Now, in order for that to work, they're going to have to offer the equivalent of what you would get in the market if you were investing in a private business. So let's say you're getting 5% real rate of return on your investments in a bakery. Then the government's going to have to give you 5.25 to make it worthwhile, right? But if they do that, what they're going to do is they're going to suck in all the capital. There's going to be nothing left for the private sector. The interest rate's going to go up because the pool of money shrinks. The economy slows down at the very time that people are struggling to get capital, and you create a recession. The government creates recessions and unemployment. There's like a triptych of these arguments that all fit together, and the proponents of them flip from one to the other to the other.
Because that third one is the one that helps explain, I guess, psychologically, another puzzle here, which is if you believe, put it crudely, if you believe the problem is that the state is this kind of greedy monster that needs purging, and the thing about austerity is it kind of bleeds it, because bleeding things is good medicine. It's medieval.
Yes, it's the binge and purge model.
You would think you would bleed it when it was sort of fat and engorged. But actually, austerity tends to kick in when the state's in trouble, when the economy is in trouble, when money is tight or whatever it is. You'd think at the crudest level, the psychology of this would be, we do the purge when we notice this thing has got absolutely kind of bloated and massive. But actually, the purging tends to happen when there's not much to purge. Isn't that part of the weirdness of this?
It is part of the weirdness, but again, if you stay in that sort of triptych of ideas that we were just talking about, it kind of makes sense, which is, so things are going well. Imagine it's like the nice years, as Mervyn King called them, non-inflationary consistent expansion, right? So the first 8 years of the Blair administration, cool Britannia, everything's going fine. So let's hack away at the state. Well, why would you want to do that? Things seem to be going fine, whatever. Well, Keynes said that when the sun is shining, that's when you should fix the roof. Yeah, whatever, nobody cares. And then, boom, suddenly you got a financial crisis. You have an enormous deficit to cover. The financial markets start freaking out. Interestingly, they didn't actually freak out in Britain, but that's a different story. We just pretended they did. And then, in principle, you have to raise more revenue at a time when asset sales are not generating money in the private sector. So the central bank has to come in with, as they call it, outside money, and that ends up creating more debt. And then it becomes, now you have to do it, which of course is insane and suicidal, but you can see where the logic from it follows.
So we're going to do the financial crisis, the 21st century one, and we're going to talk about the 20th century as well. So some of this story starts in the 19th century. So states didn't used to do much. So they didn't need that much money by modern standards. But through the 19th century, second half of the 19th century, say take the British state, it starts to accumulate obligations. And it goes along with this just consistent anxiety that the bigger the state gets, the tougher we have to be. So you get kind of Gladstonian finance. A balanced budget is just, we're not even going to argue about it. It's the background fact because we haven't created welfare states yet, but we're just inching into modern politics. This thing called democracy is coming. Oh my God, we need to be super careful. So it's like the hyper-vigilant version of it, which runs through, and you've got the gold standard in the background as well. All of this disciplining effects as we tiptoe into modernity. And you've got this in the background through, and then the First World War kind of blows it up. But then through the 20s and the 30s, this is where it gets sort of psychologically hard to explain, because this idea is then tested to destruction. So one of the big puzzles I think about austerity, this is one of the things I really would like your help in understanding, is why didn't the experience of the 1930s, so through the 20s to the 30s, why didn't it destroy this idea? Because it seems like it's quite hard for austerity to come back from it so obviously leading to catastrophe.
Partly because it's, and this is something we can elaborate on, it's such a commonsensical idea that if things are tight, then you need to tighten your belt, right? The family spent too much money. We need to rein it in. No foreign holidays this year, et cetera, et cetera. And then you get the Merkel version of the Schwabian housewife and so on and so forth, And I remember I wrote a letter to the Financial Times when Glenn Hubbard, who was running the CE at that point, pointed out that when the Hubbard family spends too much, they have to tighten their belt and the government's just the same. And I said, so are there Hubbard bonds? Are there Hubbard dollars? Are there Hubbard intergenerational liabilities? I mean, like, what exactly are we talking about here? So to your point, right, I think there's two ways of looking at this. The first one is there are three types of economists. There are supply-side economists, demand-side economists, and profit-side economists. I like to think about profits. What was going on in the 20s and 30s was a collapse in profits and wages simultaneously. That's why the politics got so nasty. In the latter half of the 19th century, in Italy and the United Kingdom, economists very much saw austerity as a way of disciplining labour to maintain profits. Right, and that was very much wired into it. And we see an echo and a replay of this in the profits crisis in the 1970s as well. Sort of the notion we have to restore capital, we have to restore the rate of profit, otherwise what's the point? Inflation's eating away, etc. Right? So that's partly why it holds on now. The second one is because we forgot that we had a long period where this didn't apply, which was the Bretton Woods period. There were lessons learned from the 1930s. And when you set up the Bretton Woods institutions, we think about the World Bank, the IMF, etc. But we also had these domestic complements. You mentioned them earlier, welfare states. How do you get welfare states? Capital controls. You have credit controls. You have a lot of financial regulation. All of these things that create very favorable conditions for producing a kind of full employment economics. Ultimately, that hits profits, and you start to get into the 70s and into the 80s. But for a while, it was a very, very different non-austerian regime, whereby the policy variable that was targeted wasn't price stability, it wasn't profit, it was full employment. So there was a period, we had those, the French call them le Trente Glorieuses, the Italians call it il boom, etc., right? Wirtschaftswunder, pick your name for it. But there was that period. So when it came back again in the 70s and the 80s, it was an echo of how bad it was in the 1930s. Then it stabilized. And we kind of forgot it again because what we did was by liberalizing credit markets, we essentially took the financial constraint away from consumption. And we handed it to people as individuals and corporates and so on and so forth. So we kind of got rid of the constraint on the state's budget needing to maintain the stability for everyone because we basically dumped a lot of that onto credit production at the private sector. And that allowed us to continue with pretending, in a sense, there was no austerity constraint. And that pretense continued right to about 2008.
Just to go back to the 30s, let's do a bit about what actually happened then, because I also want to ask a question about the 40s, because I think the 40s is crucial in this. I think the war is crucial for understanding how people think about this. But when the global economy was teetering on the edge of a cliff at the beginning of the 1930s, the impulse was to belt tighten. And that was partly, as you say, because there's just a sort of basic, even among so-called experts, a basic commonsensical understanding that that was what was needed. The problem was also everyone did it at the same time, right? Because we're going to talk a bit later about what might happen in particular places if you tighten when other places are doing okay. But the catastrophe is everybody doing it at the same time. How clear was it? At what point did people realize this is just a disaster? Or were they kind of sleepwalking into this? Is it like a pre-First World War story. They were locked in. And even when they could see if we do it and they do it and they do it and they do it, we're all going to hell. They just couldn't stop.
When Churchill's deciding to go back on gold in 25-26, Cunliffe at the Bank of England, Churchill and Keynes, they have dinner every night for about 6 months. And Churchill was completely willing to be persuaded and implicitly understood that going back on gold would be massively deflationary. It would impact wages, unemployment would go up. But he was still of the belief that, and then it will right itself. And Keynes was trying to dissuade him otherwise, but really didn't have, if we call it the fallacy of composition argument, right? That individually this is rational, collectively this is suicidal. And he just wasn't able to join the dots as he was almost a decade later as to why this is a really bad idea. So it's not what we were all waiting on enlightenment for Keynes. There were different versions of this around the world. There was a kind of inchoate feeling that if we all do these things collectively, it doesn't work out as if you do them individually. But there was no, in a sense, math. Right, there was no clear understanding of that. And plus, there was like decades and decades of tradition. You had central banks that were basically the way to do this is deflation. They'd been used to working in a gold standard. Wages and prices were the adjustment valve. They went down and they went up. And if you got in the way of them, that was a bad thing. So there was the hold of old ideas and the kind of lack of coherence of new ideas that made this happen. And then you had countries basically like France, for example, that just said, we don't care. We're just going to play spoiler in the system. We're going to hoard gold. We're going to care about our own interests. Germany's a total basket case at this point in time. Before the Wall Street crash, Fed raises interest rates. All the short-term capital is invested in Germany comes out. Then you start to get the Chancellor booning austerity budgets. It just turns into a mess. I'm sitting here in the United States. The United States love to say that, the Smoot-Hawley tariffs caused the Great Depression. We were already on the floor by the time that Smoot-Hawley happened. I mean, if it was anything, it was a coup de grace.
As you move through the 30s, and this is going on, as you say, by the mid-30s, Keynes maybe is offering an intellectual template for understanding that there is another way of doing this. But is there a point in a kind of collective austerity story where is it collective sort of psychology that takes hold, or is it actually almost impossible for one country to go down a different path? As you go through the 30s, with hindsight, it looks like collective madness. And yet, presumably at the time, it was very hard to see it like that, even after Keynes had given a framework for thinking about this.
And there were real interests in play. So, for example, Britain's problem was it had destroyed so much of national capital during World War I that the claim to go back on the gold standard at the prior rate was incredible. It had to result in massive deflation to adjust for the fact that you destroyed so much capital. But if you didn't do that, you had, as they called them, the external balances, the sterling balances, lots of people holding sterling assets outside who now had something else called the dollar. And they could switch out of that. And if you did this, you'd have a catastrophic run on the exchanges. So the Brits were damned if they did and damned if they didn't. And that's why Churchill felt compelled to do this. So there was a kind of iron cage of inevitability of sort of thinking and trying to restore a kind of gold standard economy because that's the only thing that they knew, of which austerity is a hardwired component. And then the struggling towards something new, which to bring in the war really only begins to take shape when Roosevelt basically isolates the US economy. The Brits give up trying to go on gold. You get partial reflation, which is a bit educative, shall we say. But it's really the sort of the isolation of the national economy and militarization of those economies that finally gets us to full employment. And that's the sort of the lesson learned that, oh, look, if you actually spend a ton of money, it's not just the sake of spending money, that there are these, if you will, output gaps. There are wasted resources. And ultimately, if you employ them, then this becomes self-sustaining. And that was sort of the enlightenment of that period, that you can have these pressure cooker economies where higher wages are paid for by higher productivity, and higher productivity maintains profits. You split the capital labor ratio right along the productivity line, both sides benefit, and you don't have to go back to the 30s. And that was kind of the lesson learned.
But do you think the lesson that was also partly learned is that it was a war? And so therefore, this thing that happened, so austerity through the 30s, it's a disaster. Countries collectively take the world to the worst place it's possible to imagine. And a war comes, it's a horrific experience, it's a horrific collective experience. But it does mean the end of austerity because war requires that. And it requires a completely different kind of economic organization and mindset. And thoughts about purging the state go out of the window because you're fighting for your life. At the end of that, you've sort of shown that austerity is not the way to go, but you've shown it through a war that no one wants to repeat. So you do create the institutions to try and learn some of those lessons, but also in the background, do you think of policymakers' minds is the thought that that lesson is a slightly, I don't know what word I'm looking for here. It's a lesson to be very wary of, because a wartime economy should not be the template for how we do these things generally. And somehow, if you get trapped into thinking that that wartime economy showed us the way to go, you will be in the wrong place, because all of the discipline went out of the window. Borrowing went off the charts. Money was being splurged across the board, trying to build weapons. The United States, threw money at everything in the hope that, 1 in 20 things would work and they might get a viable warship or whatever it was. It just feels like if the Second World War was the proof that austerity is a bad idea, it's a weak proof because it was the Second World War.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. A contemporary example might be Russia. I mean, Western analysts have been waiting for the collapse of the Russian economy for the past 4 years, and it singularly hasn't happened. And despite all of the sanctions and everything else, because they're running a war economy, they're growing faster than the European allies of the Ukraine. So, this works, but you don't necessarily want to go there, right? So the question becomes, how do you create, without warfare, without existential threat, without all the disciplines being off, perfect hothouse for capital? And I think one of the other lessons that we get over a broad scope here is the importance of keeping capital at home. So one of the stories is the secret history of the Marshall Plan. And the secret history of Marshall Plan is that it was capital flight from Europe, that essentially you could basically convert all these really weak post-war European currencies into the pound and then the pound into the dollar. Where would you rather be if you were an Italian family with money, in New York or in Bologna waiting for the Reds, right? So all the money goes out. And this coincides with 46, 47, really bad winters, so on and so forth, all the dislocation of the war. And the Americans basically have to take public taxpayers' money because they can't find the capital flight money and put it back into Europe, right? And this creates a sort of an opinion of finance in particular that if we want to stabilize anything, investment has to happen in these national economies. And these national economies have to have limits on how far capital can go. So I think what really distinguishes, if you will, an anti-austerity economics is the ability and willingness to discipline finance and financial flows. And when you live in that period, that's an anti-austerity period. But once you've basically said to capital, go anywhere you like for the highest return, then you have the golden straitjacket problem. Either you give them what you want or they're out. And what they want is basically not so much no spending, but much more of an Austerian viewpoint.
And how much of that post-war story is conditional on the fact that there was a superpower, not just a political but economic superpower in the United States, that was able to impose itself? Because a lot of this is about international collective action problems. That was the problem of the 30s. So one of the reasons why the war and then the post-war period are so different is that the Americans could do that. And again, there's that thing of the things that show that austerity is a bad idea also look like they're quite anomalous. We can sort of feel like, yeah, but that was just because they were able to do it. They were fighting a war. The Americans were just basically running the world at that point. How does it help us in a world where those conditions don't hold?
I mean, if we think about it in terms of origins, the fact that the United States themselves really disciplined domestic finance in the 30s and then in the 40s, because of capital flight from Europe, really put them on the naughty step and just stopped international flows for a very long time. There were no global derivatives markets. There were no global forex markets. It was a very different world. That was definitely a permissive condition. Do we have those without the United States happening now? Many of these things could be done today. It's just a question of whether politicians and sort of elites in general think it's a good idea. So, for example, you can't tax financial transactions, they'll go somewhere else. Buried deep within Trump's big, beautiful bill is a proposal to tax the holders of foreign dollar assets. This is part of their concern with global imbalances and reindustrialization. You can do it if you want to. Like, could the EU have a much more aggressive fiscal stance? Absolutely. It would simply need to double or triple the EU's budget, which isn't that hard because it's only 1% of GDP. And they would need to stop exporting to the rest of the world because China's got that market they need to consume more. So it goes back to this thing of, you know what you need to do. It's just whether you have the courage or will to actually try it. And the thing about wartime is that's when you find the courage and the will. There's a really good book that just came out by Leah Downey.
We did a podcast with her just a few weeks ago, yeah.
All right, so you know the story there, right? And I think the great thing about Leah's book is she points out that when you sort of technocratify all of finance and, you know, how you govern it and so on, and you hike it off to independent central banks, then parliaments become just kind of bullshit tweet shops. You don't really give them any responsibility to do anything. So they just degenerate and they end up just being kind of like what we have now, which is like the C team arguing against the B team. So there's an argument within all this, I think, that sort of what austerity does is it makes you irresponsible because ultimately you don't get to do anything that's important.
So let's move forward to the financial crisis 2008 and afterwards, because I think that for people listening to this, probably that's when the word austerity came right back to the center of political argument, and politicians started using it, newspapers started writing about it. It became a thing again. And it became a thing again, not everywhere, but in a surprising number of places, including in the UK. Just take us through, with hindsight, how we should think about that period of austerity. We were told at various points for certain countries that there were no other alternatives. I think in the British case, there was an understanding it was a political choice. George Osborne almost made it clear, because he's got that twinkle in his eye, that he'd picked this as a political option to sort of divide himself from the other side and to exploit it politically. But places like Greece and Ireland were told, your states have become these kind of engorged, absurd monsters, and they need massive bloodletting. And now we're sometimes told it worked. Look at Greece, look at Ireland today. So tell us what really happened.
I'm glad you used the word what really happened because there's a wonderful sort of observational equivalence story here. So if you go back to 1991, 92, you got 25% for holding the Greek tenure. You got 14% for holding Italian, 12% for holding French. I mean, that's not bad. I mean, I'd love to get 10% for holding anything at this point in time. And it's not as if these countries are about to default. So what they were doing was pricing inflation risk, that the value of the money you get back is less because essentially these are inflation-bound economies. So in comes the promise of the euro, in comes the promise of the ECB, and everyone goes, oh, look, these countries are now not going to have a printing press. They won't be able to do inflation. The states will be disciplined. So therefore, all of their costs of financing go down. And then the story that we get is, and what did they do with it? Well, look at wage costs. Look at what happened. They basically spent all that money. And then when there was a crisis, it turns out they'd got no room because they were so uncompetitive and they got nothing to sell. And that's why we had to jerk them and do discipline, right? Now, park that story for a minute, right? Is it true that the Greeks, etc., had no alternative, particularly in Greece? Because let's face it, it was two parties that were kind of like families that took turns stealing the treasury for about 25 years. I mean, it wasn't a good fiscal situation, right? But Spain had 36% debt to GDP. They started at 60, they went down to 36. They were literally best in class for doing austerity prior to the crisis. So you can't put the same logic on those guys. Now, in a big financial crisis, there's only a couple of things you can do. If you've got a printing press, you can inflate your way out of trouble, print. You can default on the external, right? You can let the exchange rate do it, which is the nice way of defaulting on the external. Or you can tighten your belt and do austerity, shrink your deficit so that your debt accumulation slows down. Then bond markets like you get better finance, and you grow your way out of it. That at least is the theory. Now, let me run this story again, because that version of the story says the Greeks, etc., had to do it. Here's another one. I'm a bond trader. I get 25 for holding Greece. This EU thing coming in is a pain in my butt because I can make really easy money just swapping around these sovereign debts that are yielding over 10%. Now, I know that all these guys are basically going to join the euro and they're not going to have a printing press, etc. anymore. And in a way, that's good for me. It's better for them. But ultimately, how do I make as much money on a declining spread? Well, if I'm making 100 million on 25, what happens when it goes to 12? I'm going to have to double the bet. What happens when it goes to 6.25? I'm going to have to quadruple the bet. So I'm going to end up basically playing tons and tons of leverage into these trades to make the same amount of money. In other words, it's not that they're over lending. I'm over borrowing. I'm buying as many of these things as I can. That's what causes the yield compression. And then it turns out when there's a crisis, bang, who's the people holding all those bonds? French and German banks. And what did they do? They needed a bailout. But having done a bailout in 2008 and 2009, Merkel and the French government couldn't turn around at that point and say, sorry, folks, we need to bail out the banks again. So they said it was a sovereign debt crisis. They literally just swapped the label on it. It was a private sector lending crisis that was actually called a public sector overspending crisis. Now, these two things are, in the statistics, observationally equivalent, but I argue that it was clearly a banking crisis because the entire thing was a banking crisis. And basically, French banks in particular were too big to fail, too big to bail, actually, in that sense. The top three were 230% of GDP as their asset footprint. Any one big French bank going down would take out the treasury. So they couldn't be allowed to fail. Now, that's what happened. Why do we still think this is a crisis of public finance? Because the first one's so much easier to understand. And after all, it's the Greeks. What do you expect? And the Portuguese and the Spanish and, the racism that goes into the gypsies and the pigs and all the rest of it. It's an easy, lazy explanation that takes the heat off what we did through the banking system.
But given what we did, what was the option for the Greeks in 2010, 2011, given the position they were in? Or were they trapped politically?
Well, they were trapped politically, and there's no doubt that they freaked out the bond market by basically saying that, we've been lying about our debts and deficits, right? But why should that have such an effect? Greece used to be 3% of the Eurozone GDP. The financial crisis and austerity reduced it to 1.6. Why would that matter? Well, because you've got these banks that have these hugely levered portfolios where even if they lose a tiny bit on Greece, in order to be whole, they have to sell on the next asset, which is Ireland. And then they have to sell on Portugal. And if everybody does that, you get a contagion run and it ends up in Spain or Italy, and the whole thing goes bang. So, of course, the Europeans put their foot on the Greeks to stop it. But the lesson is, how did you actually really solve this crisis? When Mario Draghi came in and said, we're actually a real central bank, I've got this, I'll do whatever it takes, and all the yields dropped. It was nothing to do with squeezing the Greeks to death. That was punitive punishment.
As you describe it there, to go back to where we started, you paint a picture of some truly engorged institutions. But it's not states, it's private, it's banks. The picture you paint there of the French banks are like, these kind of fat monsters overshadowing a national economy. So if that's the truth, it would feel like, so you can't bleed them at the height of the crisis because everyone goes down. But once you've stabilized, you would think, right, we do need some austerity here, but not in the public sector. We need to discipline the banks. So that feels like it's always the missing piece. If we go back to the psychology of this, which is we get scared because we end up with institutions that seem out of control, the institutions that you've just described as being out of control, for maybe good reasons, that bond trader that you described, he's rationally maximizing his options. But the result is a monster, a bloated monster. These institutions are bloated monsters, or maybe even blood-sucking monsters, in one phrase. Why does austerity never get switched from public to private?
So politically, it does get switched from private to public, but it doesn't go the other way precisely because of where we started, right? What is the origin of austerity? You don't want the state to get too big because ultimately it'll threaten your property. So if you have that in the back of your mind and you think that modern bond markets are filled with vigilantes who want you to do the absolute minimum, etc., then the notion that you would turn around and discipline your credit markets, that's the very people you're borrowing from. There's no chance that you're going to do this. So go back to that. How do we keep the state in check? We keep it at arm's length because we develop bond markets. Well, then am I going to basically go after the biggest bondholders or the institutions that intermediate their bonds? Not unless I want to commit fiscal suicide. So they always get a hall pass. They always get a bailout. That's how it works. But then you got to say where this came from and why we've all got to suffer. So you get the belt tightening story and we spent too much and so on and so forth. And that allows the system to continue.
So in the UK case, after the financial crisis, again, very big banks that had become monsters and the state was on the hook for them. George Osborne then, so I'm really interested in the way in which austerity has become a kind of meme in British politics, because it seems to have this complete sort of schizophrenic role, which is that it's become a very dirty word, right? Politicians are always insisting they're not going back to austerity. And at the same time, I think there's a belief among politicians that George Osborne is a kind of political magician, because after all, he presided over this period, then got his party re-elected and got his coalition partners more or less destroyed. And that austerity is this constant temptation. It's almost like it's a bad idea, it's a dirty word, but it is the thing we're going to have to keep being drawn back to, like moths to the flame. I don't get it.
Yeah, maybe from a kind of like strategic point of view within parties. But I mean, if we actually think about what happened in Britain, I would tell the story like this. You had a very unpopular prime minister in the form of Gordon Brown. People were exhausted by Labour. It is true that at the end of their term, they just started chucking money at stuff to make it better. And then when the financial crisis hit, they were definitely exposed. There was a kind of belief through television programs like Benefit Street and all this sort of politicization of stuff that ultimately there's a huge amount of spongers and there's the makers versus the takers, the whole lot. And the kind of like hug-a-hoodie one nation Toryism that David Cameron represented, Osborne was always kind of the bastard child in that one. And it was quite clear that there was a constituency in the Tory party that thought spending 35% of GDP through the state was already enough. And what this did was to create a moment of opportunity whereby yields were falling. This is what's really important, right? Britain was seen as a safety asset because it had its own currency and it could bail its own banks. So even though as a percentage of GDP, the total size of the British banking sector was bigger than that of France or Germany, it didn't matter because ultimately you got the Bank of England, and the Bank of England can secure swap loans from the States, and that means that the banks can stay whole. Consequently, bond market yields went down. Britain was a safety asset. There was no need for austerity in that regard, but it was a great political opportunity because now you could really sort of like reverse course and become much, much more true to your conservative self. What were the consequences of this? Basically, programs like the bedroom tax and other welfare reforms done in the name of austerity are really your best predictors of exactly which areas vote for Brexit. So, the consequences of this were not just economically foolish, they were desperately foolish politically, because it engendered the sense of, particularly in the north of England and parts of Scotland, an idea that basically the southern Tory state is after us. This empowered the Scottish National Party for a very long period of time. The consequences of this ultimately led to Brexit and what's followed since then. So I think that the austerity period here, if that's something people are drawn to like moths to the flame, then like those moths, they're going to burn up very quickly.
It is strange in British politics, thinking about how people use the language of austerity now. The current government in Britain, austerity is the thing that they define themselves against. No, to be clear, at the moment they define themselves against two things. They define themselves against George Osborne's austerity and Liz Truss's period of madness. These are the two things. So these are the two ways in which the Labour Party is able to say, we will never return you to those two things. But the second thing, which seems to be the one that looms largest, seems to require them to do something which is a sort of austerity light. Why can't they escape that straitjacket? Is it again a political choice? So Liz Truss is a very useful tool for a sort of shorthand for, we're not that lot. But the result of not being that lot is that they're a little bit like the George Osborne lot.
So there's a bunch of stuff going on here. One is kind of the ingrained commitment to fiscal rules. Now, fiscal rules make sense in a low volatility environment because if things aren't changing a lot and you target a variable, you've got a fair chance of hitting the variable. We don't live in that world. We've got tariffs, inflation, supply shocks, climate shocks, right? So having fiscal, you're guaranteed to fail. They're simply not going to be hit. So you'll lose whatever credibility you think you get from this. Second thing is loads of survey work and experimental work are done on this. The public doesn't really get the whole thing about credibility and markets and all this sort of stuff. They care about things like price levels. And it seems to be basically that Reeves in particular just gets a memo from the Treasury in the morning, this is how much you'll not get to spend, and from the Bank of England saying this is areas you're not going to go anywhere near, like, for example, why we give billions and billions to banks for parking their reserves at the central bank when there are other ways of setting monetary policy. So they seem to be trapped within the set of beliefs about credibility and fiscal rules, etc., which is then encased in a sort of like this focus on Liz Truss, which basically, again, I think they fetishize far more than markets fetishize. And then Osborne is like a disappearing over the horizon memory. Now, when you talk to people in bond markets, like, what do they want? They want Britain to grow. There's a lot of British debt, and so long as the economy is growing faster than the rate of growth in the debt stock and the nominal interest rate on the debt, knock yourself out. Nobody gives it's totally fine, right? But what they really worry about is when you think the economy is a biscuit tin And the two sources of influx of the biscuit tin are the Treasury and the Bank of England saying you can't spend anything. And you've been stuck on a 1% growth rate for basically 15 years. You're on your way to becoming Italy. You need to do something. And they seem to be utterly paralyzed. And it comes across, when you add all this together, it's basically their particular hellish form of self-imposed austerity.
And is it a story which will require an external shock, not on the scale of the Second World War? COVID wasn't the right kind of thing to do this because it was a very specific and time-limited thing. But it's like they're waiting for something to give them permission to do the thing that they could do anyway. So the deficit here is what? Political courage, imagination?
I think that's it. I think that the people who are running Labour now, I mean, if you look at Starmer, I don't mean this in an offensive way. I mean this is an accurate description. He strikes me as somebody who's really good at running a complex office, by which I mean he's a bureaucrat. He's devoid of vision. He has no vision. Strategically, they seem to be clueless. I mean, you don't go after pensioners in Britain unless you've got a death wish, and then you reverse what you've done to the pensioners, right? The national insurance rise was the dumbest tax rise I think I've ever heard of, because all you need to do is look at the structure of the British economy and realise most of your employment growth is coming from small to medium-sized firms. I mean, it's just like dumb, dumb, and dumber. Like, why are you doing this stuff? I genuinely don't understand it. And there seems to be no way to correct for this. I think if there's going to be a shock, it's going to come from the fact that although those Labour MPs sitting in the back benches that won back those northern constituencies and other places and places in Scotland realise that their jobs are very much on the line, and this continuing inaction and inability to do anything different from what the Treasury and Bank of England would like as the optimal policy is going to cost them big at the next election. So I think the shock will basically be that Starmer and Reeves really have to start looking about whether they are capable of leading a party or whether they need to step aside and let someone else try it.
To return to the idea of austerity itself, it's like it's this zombie idea. So here you have a group of politicians who say, austerity is a bad thing. We have experience in Britain of the damage that it did, so we're not going to do that. But it also sets the limits of what's possible. It's like a background idea. So we're not going to embrace austerity, but we're going to be haunted by it. We're going to be haunted by the underlying psychological or political mindset that has made it sort of the companion to the state for 300 years, as though it's just sort of hardwired into the system itself as a background zombie idea that just frames the limits of the possible. So it's not the real risk is that a repeat of the 1930s, but the risk is paralysis, because the idea of austerity, the thing that we're not going to do, is also the thing that sets the limits to what we think is possible.
I think that's exactly right. And, from the point of view of the Treasury, what is the Treasury? I think of the Treasury as sort of the public sector of the following maxim in banking. What's the first rule of banking? Don't give money to anybody who needs it. Right, that's literally the first rule of banking, right? You do it on the basis of profit, not need. And what's the first rule of the Treasury? Don't spend any money unless you absolutely have to. So if you've got that, and then you have a particularly conservative Bank of England, which is what we have at the moment under its current configuration, all the stuff about green investment or whatever is just total greenwashing. None of that's going on. Then unless you have a chancellor that's willing to actually say, no, we're going to do something different and get on board, this is how we're doing it, then you're just going to be stuck in that box. And I'll give you an example of this. So every time that the yield on a 10-year Treasury goes up, the commentariat say, oh, Reeves, and it's terrible, and there's so much spending, and the bond markets are worried. Honestly, what the bond markets are saying is you're still not growing. You're still not doing anything. You're just farting around. And we're getting a little bit concerned about this lack of growth. You need to do something about it. Instead of which, what do we do? We'll need to raise taxes and then bugger up the middle-sized companies in the United Kingdom, because that'll really help. You're right about this. It's this background condition that they seem unable to escape from, because they're still wedded to this idea that the way that you get success in an economy is not through sort of bold investments and re-engineering your growth model, taking sectors in which you have commanding leads, such as the defense sector in the United Kingdom, doubling down on that, betting on these things. It's by basically making up rules and saying to everyone, look, I made the rules. That's it. We're great. Isn't that fantastic? It's like, what are you doing?
So I want to ask you about Argentina, because I've read quite a few articles recently that, if we're talking about political courage, that laud the political courage of Javier Milei and hold him up as the guy who really bucked the consensus that people said you can't do what he did, which was, let's call it extreme austerity, right? It is really going for it. So he's embracing it. It's not a background condition for him. It's his chainsaw. And articles saying it looked like madness, but what are we, a year in or something? We can now see that this guy he's really got balls of steel or whatever they say in that kind of commentary. And he's shown that actually the courage that's needed in the contemporary economy is on that side of the ledger. So how are we meant to read those arguments?
I totally get that, and I've actually spent a bit of time thinking this one through, and here's how I think about it. What's the most important thing that you have to think about the environment in which Milei is operating and why it's not the environment that Britain or America and anyone else is operating in? Indigenous and endogenous hyperinflation. Right? Now, here's the difference. The way that the Argentine economy works is it's a giant commodity exporter, and it's also a regionalized economy with different power bases. Those guys sit in part of the upper house. They veto anything that they don't like. They make money off commodities. When the world economy is growing, then you invest in commodities. And then when it's growing, you invest in more commodities and you get what's called a super cycle. So basically, you keep planting more soy, China keeps buying it. But eventually, you and Brazil and everybody produce so much soy that the price collapses, right? When that happens, because you're a commodity exporter, your exchange rate collapses. When your exchange rate collapses, it turns out you import almost everything except the stuff that you export, which is very few things. When that goes to hell in a handbasket, you got to pay for everything: medicines, cars, computers, the whole lot. So what do? You run the printing presses and you get a second inflation shock, and that's why it just persists. Now, what Milei did was say, hey, poor people, you've got this party called the Peronistas, and what they do is they just basically throw you sweeteners every now and again to basically offset the inflation costs, usually when there's an election coming round. Other than that, they don't give a shit about you. Hey, you people in the middle, you're the ones that are the hard workers, pay taxes. You've all got dollar accounts. You wouldn't hold pesos because basically it gets eaten away by nothing. Wouldn't it be nice if you didn't have to do that? Hey, rich people, same thing. Wouldn't it be nice if we didn't have to trade in dollars and the peso was worth something, and ultimately we could get rid of inflation, because then you'd have higher profits. And then honestly, you could actually pay higher wages. So what he did was he took a third of the poor, a third of the middle, a third of the top, and made an anti-inflationary coalition. Because if you're in the bottom and you have nothing but 20 to 40 to 60% inflation, sometimes a month, going on for years and years and years, that is epically awful. And you can build an electoral coalition around that. Now, park all that for a minute. Does that have any lessons at all for a deflating economy, which is generally what Britain is, apart from the supply shocks that came from Ukraine? No. Does this show that austerity works? Well, it shows that you can get people who are being really battered by inflation to batter down on inflation. Whether this is actually going to lead to long-term sustainable growth in what is still a business model which is basically cyclical with commodities, that remains to be seen. But what he did was he built an anti-inflation coalition, and he was very successful in doing that.
And does it also depend on the fact that he is doing something which makes him a bit of an outlier in the global economy? If everyone did what he did, what he was doing would be a disaster for his country too.
There would be no global economy left, right? That's it. There'd be nothing left.
Yeah, exactly. So this is definitely not the 1930s, right? I mean, Argentina, it has at least the luxury, partly because he was the first mover. Let's hope it's not a chain, but by being an outlier, and I think there is political courage involved in this, or maybe courage is the wrong word, but a certain, an eye for the main chance. He was able to do something in Argentina which does make sense in terms of his own country's situation. There is no global lesson from this.
Exactly. Argentina is Argentina, and if you want to build an anti-inflationary coalition to stabilize Argentina, you can definitely do that. Does that have lessons for countries which are not Argentina? I'm a bit skeptical. And as we say, if everybody does it at once, all you do is shrink the overall size of the economy.
So finally, DOGE. I want to get your take on DOGE, because DOGE is also an extension of the hundreds-year-old austerity idea. And Elon Musk has gone through this weird transformation. Ross Douthat wrote a good piece about this in the New York Times, saying he thought that Musk was a kind of go-to-Mars guy, and he's become a deficit scold. And he said that's not his skill set. Like, there are deficit scolds out there. They can do it better than him, and it's a wearying kind of business. It's a total waste of Elon Musk's talents for him to turn into a deficit scold. So if austerity has even kind of got its teeth into Elon Musk, what's going on with DOGE?
So the first thing to say about DOGE is the background to all of this, which is if you are the United States and you issue the global reserve asset, the promise to repay a bond is to repay it in money. And the United States can't default. So anyone who says that literally doesn't understand how these markets work, because ultimately you can't default because the only thing you can get paid in is money, and we can print as much of that as you want. Now, you may want to hold something else like gold or crypto or whatever, and you're totally free to do that, but you literally can't go bankrupt, right? Now, what's the analog in the state? The analog is corruption, waste, fraud, corruption, waste, fraud. Well, it turns out the reason that bureaucrats don't double their budget and hire their grandma is because there's so many restrictions on what they can do precisely because they're public jobs. What about waste? Is there waste? Yeah, it's all in the Pentagon, but nobody's going to ever touch that one. Okay. What about fraud? Incredibly low rates of fraud because the penalties are huge. You want to do fraud? Do it in the private sector. Medicaid fraud is unbelievably profitable. You're not going to try and do that in the Department of Labor. This is just nonsense, right? So they went in there with an ideological fixation looking for elephants that didn't exist and singularly failed to find them. Now, there's a more insidious reading of this that what he was really doing was taking a hacker team into the central government so that he could basically figure out not just the plumbing, but what the digital architecture of it was so that that could be monetized at some future date. I think that's entirely plausible. But in terms of what it really changed is, was this an austerity thing? If it was, it massively failed on its own terms. And all that you ended up doing was terrorizing a bunch of skilled employees that it turns out you kind of need if you want to run a 21st century state and economy.
Is the lesson here that the idea of austerity, which is just attached to public money, public spending, what states do, what government officials do, is quite a useful idea, but not applied to those things in the sense that, Musk, presumably part of what he brought into this was his knowledge about the ways in which in the private sector, in some of the businesses that he's run, there are moments where you've absolutely got to go in with a chainsaw and save the business by being brutal in some of the things that you do. But businesses, partly with the aid of government support because they've got their teeth into government, that just get massively bloated and grotesque. We don't think that austerity is the thing that we do there. It's just constantly hooked onto the state itself. Is it an idea that's a bad idea? Not because it is a bad. Sometimes austerity is a good idea, right? Maybe including in families, right?
My colleague here, Andrew Schrank, has a nice paper he did with a graduate student simply called Bloat. He's an organizational sociologist and basically points out that organizations are efficient when they're kind of like pyramids and they're functionally divided. When they become diamonds, then you've got a problem. And he has the paper where he looks at everything from Communist Party purges to American corporations' use of early retirement before age discrimination came in. And ultimately, these are all strategies to reduce bloat in the middle, right? So you can think about DOGE going in there and it's bloat, it's getting bloat, right? But when you control for population, the United States federal government is smaller than it was in 1971. And the economy is infinitely more complex. People want infinitely more things from the government. So the notion that this is this bloated institution is well, go on then. Take 10% of them out and see what happens. And it turns out you can't. You have to start rehiring these people because, what do? I just inspect nuclear weapons. Well, get you out then. Oh, hang on a minute. We don't want to do that one. You need to come back. So, yeah, I think it's very much more of a sort of a meme understanding of how things work, which is very popular in politics. This goes back to Leah Downey's point, right? That if there's no consequences for what you say and what you do in the legislature because all the real toys have been taken away and given to experts and central banks and all the rest of it, right? Then you can start to believe some really dodgy stuff. And then when you get a chance to do these things, you can do a great deal of damage because they're actually quite divorced from the world that you actually live in. And I think that's ultimately the really destructive legacy of austerity thinking. There's always bloat, there's always fraud, there's always abuse, there's always waste. We can always cut. You feel Farage, right? Cut DEI and we'll have growth in Britain. Come on. What are you talking about, right? But this is the way that the arguments get structured and we get caught in that. And then that seems to be the only kind of possibility space you can operate in.
So one last question. Part of the appeal of austerity is that it is a word that people understand, and it's got a kind of edge to it, a clarity to it. And there isn't an equivalent word for the other things that you might do. And when you went through your list there, those are bad words, right? We'll always have waste. Waste is very useful. It turns out that, that's the great thing about war. Incredible amounts of wasted public spending, which turns out, astonishing amounts of both innovation and ultimately growth. But you're not going to win an election on the waste program. Is there a word? Is there an idea for I want to say not the opposite of austerity, but the alternative to it that has equivalent punch. Growth won't do it because growth is too ecumenical an idea. Everyone is in favor of it.
Yes, exactly. And then, of course, now you've got sort of the degrowthers on the green side who are like, we need to have massive permanent austerity in order to survive. It's not exactly an electoral winner. The book that's doing the rounds over here, I don't know how much it's penetrated the UK yet, is Klein's Abundance, right? And this is an attempt to do this, to turn it round that way. What's interesting about that, though, is rather than dealing with the kind of the, if you will, the macro side of like, how does your economy actually work? What do you produce? Like Germany, for example. Why is Germany in the doldrums permanently, right? Despite being the world's biggest exporter. Well, precisely because it's the world's biggest exporter, right? There are pathologies that go along with this. And they don't choose to deal with that stuff so much as kind of things like, the regulatory environment, the fact that we don't build houses, we could do more, whatever. In a sense, there's an agenda of abundance to be embraced, right? And I think that's one part of trying to get towards that. The problem with abundance is it strikes me it's one of these words like thriving. It's that kind of like middle-class Christmas hamper of everybody gets something because you've been a good boy. And abundance has that same cadence for it for me. So I know where they're going, but I'm not sure if that's the word I would use for it.
I mean, for me, it's a little bit like wellness.
Yes. Yeah, 100%. Yes.
It's just, I was trying to think as you were talking why it's an off-putting word. I'm not saying the ideas behind it are off-putting, but as a banner behind which the people are going to march to liberate themselves from the central banks and all the rest of it. Abundance, I don't know what it is, but it's compared to austerity, it sounds a little woo-woo.
It does, exactly. It does. Austerity has a hard edge to it, a good Presbyterian Scottish hard edge to it. Like every now and again, son, you have to just have porridge. That seems to be the size of it.
Next time on The History of Bad Ideas, I'm going to be talking to the writer and broadcaster Helen Lewis about all of the very many things that are wrong with the idea of the genius, the boy genius, the person who is set apart from everyone else, all the way from Shakespeare to Silicon Valley. That's going to be next time. This has been Past, Present, Future.